Though it has passed, World Oceans Day is really an important global reminder of the significance of advocating and giving back to our oceans and their species so that they can continue to provide for us and for future generations. The theme of our discussion this evening is one of my personal favorite topics, and I'm sure that's shared amongst most of us here. It's sharks. Sharks are an evolutionary marvel. They've been around for millions and millions of years, before dinosaurs, before trees even. Unfortunately, in the last decades, we've witnessed a really large decline in their global populations, largely due to overfishing and incidental catching, also known as bycatch. This is particularly problematic for sharks because they are very, very vulnerable to these effects. They take a long time to reach sexual maturity, a long time to reproduce, and typically bear few live young. Shark conservation relies on many dimensions in order to be successful, but one of the key ones is really public engagement. And one of the best things that the public can do to participate in conservation is really, I said conversation, didn't I? I want to say conservation is really conversation. So that's what we're doing here this evening. We'll be diving into shark research and conservation here in Nova Scotia, while getting to know our wonderful panelists who are active contributors to this field. To briefly introduce myself, I'm Vanessa Schiliro, and I'll be your moderator/host this evening. I'm nearing the completion of an honors degree in marine biology here at Dalhousie. I also have a degree in psychology and human relations, which you're probably like, that's really unrelated, that doesn't make sense, but it does come full circle, I promise. I'm currently conducting my honors research in Dr. Boris Warren's lab, looking at trends in basking shark distribution in Atlantic waters and seeing how that overlaps with threats to the species like fishing pressure and vessel activity. I'm also very passionate about shark behavior and the social dimensions of shark conservation, and over the last year or so have been conducting outreach with the media to help debunk some misinformation that tends to exist about this really misunderstood and fascinating species, and also to provide tips for divers, surfers, and swimmers to coexist with white sharks peacefully. So that's enough about me. I'll get to introducing our four wonderful panelists. So first we have to my left, Dr. Harvey-Clark, University Director of Animal Care here at Dalhousie. We have Dr. Whoriskey, Executive Director at the Ocean Tracking Network, Dr. Manuel Dureuil, President of the Shark and Ray Conservation Center and IUCN Shark Specialist Group member from Northern Europe, and last but not least, Kirsti Burnett, Director and Researcher at the Shark and Ray Conservation Center. So I'll just ask each of our panelists to take a moment to tell a little bit about what they do and introduce themselves, and then we'll get diving into our questions.
Microphone, so I guess I go first. I'm Executive Director of the Ocean Tracking Network, as was mentioned. Really what I spend all my time doing is feeding the bees, finding the money that keeps this global network up and operational. I occasionally get to sneak out and do a bit of research in different places and enjoy having opportunities like this to speak to the public at large about the work that we use. The Ocean Tracking Network is about using electronic telemetry systems to track the movements and survival of marine animals and link them to environmental conditions, especially in the face of the changing ocean. Built off of Canadian technology, most of which is built right here in Halifax by a company called Nova Scotia. So we're also a purveyor of Canadian products to a global market, which means that we can seamlessly shift depending on what government is in power between being an economic engine or being a conservation organization.
Well put. And Dr. Whoriskey happens to be my dive buddy as well. So a lot of the work we've been doing with torpedo rays, Fred and I have done. Fred has a long history of altruism. When I co-discovered a population of Greenland sharks in the St. Lawrence, and we had absolutely no resources, Fred was executive director of the Atlantic Salmon Federation, and he had telemetry equipment, and he loaned it to us. He was a silent partner in that work. And that was really the first substantive work done on tracking and understanding movement of sharks between about 2004 and sharks finally disappeared about 2011. So I'm Chris Harvey-Clark. I'm the University Director of Animal Care, which means I'm a veterinarian, also a marine biologist, and marine naturalist and underwater photographer. And I've been doing research on cold water elasmobranchs since 1991. Started with 6-gill sharks on the west coast, and did one of the first ever papers on conservation of 6 gills as an ecotourism resource, and then later Greenland sharks, and then more recently torpedo rays. The latest work that I've been doing, and Fred is involved in this as well, is with the burgeoning population of the white sharks in the North Atlantic. Thank you.
Oh, this one works. Good evening, Manuel. I'm not in the game as long as Chris or Fred. I do shark research since maybe 14, 15 years. What I'm doing at the moment is, in particular, I am co-teaching with Chris and Kirsti the first offering of the shark class here at Dalhousie. It's a wonderful class. I would have died as an undergraduate to have a class like this, to be honest. It's pretty amazing, not because of us, but because of the topic. And otherwise, I spent a significant amount of time on researching Cabo Verde. It's a little island in West Africa where we are establishing a black-chin guitarfish tagging project. Black-chin guitarfish are one of the most threatened of all fish that there are out there. And it's a wonderful location. And it's one of the few locations, I would say, in West Africa that allow you to do a lot of things. Hopefully also including future classes and corporations. And then I also built a historical working group with the IUCN, where we try to look at historical information, not so much model, like real information that's hundreds of years old, maybe from the medieval times or something from that time, to see where sharks and skates and rays actually have been. What we find so far is that a lot of this information is not always available in English, and that a lot of those species actually don't occur there anymore where they were regularly reported in the past, which of course is a problem, so we are lacking the baseline. Yeah, and maybe that's enough about me.
Hey, I'm Kirsti. So I'm actually very proud Dal alumni, and took place in the very first shark class that ever was at Dalhousie when Dr. Whoriskey was my professor. And moved on from that to be a TA on the course, and now I am teaching the course. So it's just, I couldn't have dreamed of that moment when I was a student in the class that I would come full circle to actually be teaching that course. But aside from that, I actually just finished my master's degree in marine biology at the University of Bremen in Germany, where my research focused on the population genomics of the black-chin guitarfish. So the sort of the work that I did was assembling the first ever reference genome for this species, but in fact for any of the giant guitarfishes in general. And as Manuel had mentioned, being one of the most threatened fish on the planet is a very important baseline resource that we need to be continuing any kind of genetic research, which I think is going to be the future for this species and other giant guitarfishes globally. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. In terms of structure, before I start asking, questions, the first 45 to 50 minutes or so, we'll go through a series of questions with the panel, and then we'll open the floor to our audience for the last 15 minutes so that you can ask your questions. So think of them as we go, and please ask them. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we're really going to try to and want to. So yeah, let's get started. So I guess to set the stage, an important question to ask would be why is shark conservation research even important in a place like Nova Scotia?
So that one comes to me first. There are a couple of ways you can answer this question. Maybe the simplest one is because we say it is. We've got regulations in place that dictate that we will take care of these sharks. Now, there are reasons behind that one as well. Almost everybody in the room here knows they're an apex predator and have some sense that they're critically important for the function of ecosystems. Ecosystems are pretty bizarre. The linkages that we have in them are not linear. And we sometimes end up with big surprises when we remove some component here and something pops out there. One of my favorite examples of this having nothing to do with sharks was when they removed the wolves from Yellowstone Park and the trout fishing collapsed. And the way this one worked is the predators were gone. The antelopes that used to stay away from the riparian sides could now get down in there and feed on all the vegetation. That opened up banks to put sediments into the river, which smothered all of the trout nests, which ended up with no trout in the system afterwards. And in retrospect, perfectly clear that these linkages should have happened, but we did not a priori manage to predict it. So coming back to the issue of sharks, maybe a couple of examples of how important they are to people now. Be the best descriptor of this one. Spent a lot of time working on Atlantic salmon. People in the Atlantic salmon world believe it is the be-all and end-all of everything, and every other component of the ecosystem that eats Atlantic salmon should be eliminated. Now, starting from that perspective, when you have seals swimming around, it's not unusual to have the salmon lobby calling for seal culls almost everywhere and under all circumstances. And this is a big problem because once you start doing something like that, then you have boycotts of Canadian seafood products into the U.S. markets because that's not permitted under those circumstances, and $3.2 billion of the Nova Scotia economy disappears. So not recommended to proceed down that way, but the salmon interests continue to pump that way. For years and years and years, when I worked there for the Salmon Federation, they would say, we want more hatcheries to get more salmon. I said, I don't want salmon hatcheries. I want white shark hatcheries. And once you put the white sharks into the system, they begin to put the fear of God into this, the seals at that point in time. And all the bottlenecks that they used to patrol when the salmon were coming in and would feed on, that's where the sharks would stake out and the seals disappear. And suddenly it begins to open it up. So this is one of those ecosystem linkages that changes the dynamics, takes care of the natural problem, and begins to put the benefits back to people. But the other thing that I'd like to highlight, Chris Harvey-Clark just mentioned this one, is about the resurgence of white sharks in this area. And there is a really big change that's underway right now in our region. Give you a sort of a broad sense of this one. There are approximately 2 to 240 acoustically tagged white sharks that are running in the Northwest Atlantic Ocean right now. And 93 of those were detected during last summer in the Mahone Bay alone. So we have a sudden resurgence of a lot of these animals. The animals are immature, subadult kinds, which means that they're just at the point of making the transition from feeding on fish to feeding on marine mammals. And they're explorers, they're kind of the teenagers that are out poking around. So interactions with people are probably highly probable now here in Nova Scotia. We need to start cluing in on this and beginning to be sharp smart surrounding this one, talking to our people, getting the education out there so that people are paying attention to this one in the same way we pay attention when we go hiking in a national park where there are a lot of bears around. We want to take certain measures, not go out there and go hiking in the park, but do the things that you need to do to stay safe. So that would be my answer.
Anybody else like to add to that?
Well, that was pretty complete. What you meant. I think it was in 2017 when I got a call from a concerned father who was always surfing with his son, 8 years old, close to Mahone Bay, asking if this is something you should do or not. And I think, as Fred said, you should be aware. I don't think back then it might have been a problem, not so sure, but I think you should be aware. And I think it's totally okay for sharks to be dangerous, also to humans. I don't know, if I would be afraid of spiders, I don't want to have more spiders to go extinct, but I think it's a great opportunity to actually weigh on this and get the public involved in seeing those animals and have more shark viewings. Not just for white sharks, we have our blue sharks here who are perfect to do so. They are sharks who don't look dangerous. They are sharks who, I mean, if you want to describe a shark as cute, you can take a blue shark. It's just like a wonderful, like just seeing the eyes. We had trips out there with young naturalist groups, and the kids were all over the sharks, how beautiful they were. With the eyes, and that they were behaving more like a cat around their bait than like what they saw the shark would behave. And I think we can wait on this in the debate and show people also the beauty and use this actually to educate people about the really severe state sharks are. I cannot stress this enough. Since I have started this, every time we learn more, we learn that they are more endangered, and the few success stories are usually from maybe North America, Australia, but wherever else you look, as more you uncover, as more threatened it is actually, and it's quite fearing to me that we will have certain species that might go extinct, at least during my lifetime, and I want to do whatever I can against this. And I believe the white shark is a good ambassador to bring money in for other species that are not so, well, let's say spectacular for the public. For biologists, they would be absolutely spectacular. If you know about tiny dogfish, then you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so.
We've mentioned the white shark a lot, but maybe if someone just wants to chime in with regards to what kind of other sharks we can find here in Nova Scotia and Canada.
I got you, Vanessa. So I'm old. I'm 62 years old. I've been diving since I was 15. And, you know, on both coasts, British Columbia, in the Arctic as well as here. And, you know, I've noticed some things, and things that haven't been really very well explained. So on this coast when I was a kid, every beach you'd walk on, everywhere, was carpeted in what were called mermaids' purses. Everywhere you went, in untold tens of thousands. These are, of course, the egg cases, mostly of the Whoriskey, although there are 3 or 4 other species that we would also see. These beautiful little brown egg cases. I've seen one lately. Gone. You know, they've been gone since at least 1997. I did a book in 1994 called Eastern Typhoon, which was the precursor of my current book, Maritime Marine Life. And at that time, they were quite abundant, 94, 95. And you would see winter skates diving everywhere in their tussles. And you would find them breeding. And you would find egg cases everywhere. Where'd they go? Question. In British Columbia, we used to see 6-gilled sharks in the 80s and 90s. There were several sites where they were quite abundant. And fishery for underexploited species was started and targeted 6-gills. 6-gills disappeared. Probably weren't that many of them to start with. This is why we need research. We don't really understand the drivers, but a whole lot of things disappeared from these coastal waters in the late 1990s. This followed the cod crisis, and we saw the disappearance of a lot of large benthic mesopredator fish. So we lost skates, we lost many species of sculpins down to minimal numbers. Wolffish disappeared. He really still understands the drivers. This is why we need research for all these species. And it's not a matter of just picking your favorite species in the ecosystem, charismatics like the white shark, but it's a whole system that needs to be looked at.
Well said. So, speaking of research, what kind of research is conducted, or would you say needed, in Nova Scotia?
All right, so I guess for my introduction, you already know I'm going to be a bit biased in this answer, but genetics. For sure, genetics is what is needed. And I'm sure that there is genetic research going on with ocean conservation right now, but specifically for sharks and rays, globally, it's quite minimal. So for example, what can we do with genetics? Why could this be important in Nova Scotia? If you've heard of eDNA, so environmental DNA, we can use samples from the waters to detect trace DNA that comes off from the animal's skin shedding or feces. And through this, we can sequence those samples, the water samples, to see the diversity of the animals in the water. And the ocean is very cool because the DNA actually degrades very quickly. So we can be sure that if we are seeing species DNA in the sample that's collected, that species has been around and it's been around recently. So what can we use this for? Well, it can be used in combination with the typical trawl surveys, for example. Maybe we can detect species that the trawl surveys just don't pick up on. Going further on that, we can use the diversity to see how diversity changes are happening as our waters are inevitably going to start getting warmer with climate change. We can track the diversity level of these species when we make an area off of Nova Scotia a marine protected area. would that one protected area be helping the shark? Well, we can use eDNA to figure that out. Are we seeing higher species diversity once that has been in place for a few years? So I really think that that's one future of genetics, but I also truly believe we need more reference genomes out there, so that's what my master's project was on. And a reference genome is essentially a whole genome that has been sequenced and put together like a puzzle, and you can use that as reference for any kind of resequencing project that you need to do. So for example, we can actually determine the genetic health of a species in something called effective population size, just by resequencing samples from a species, basically to see what the levels of inbreeding are. And through that, look at the genetic health of a population as a whole. I think even going further than that, researchers in Australia have started coming up with creating a molecular aging clock. So far, they've been successful for doing this for mammals. They've started doing work on fish, but imagine if we had one that could be calibrated to sharks and rays. And at DFO, for example, we have one of the world's leading scientists in shark and ray aging. So imagine if we could combine the molecular aging clock with what he's already done with his aging and compare the two just to see, are we getting an accurate age reading? And from this, I know we can do a lot of cool conservation work, which I will let Manu speak more about because it's more of his forte and not mine.
Thanks, Kirsti. Yeah, I did a lot of life history studies and aging. So maybe you ask yourself, why is aging important? Why would it be important to have like genomic aging? What's the problem with aging? Well, sharks are very difficult to age. You would use the vertebrate, you would cut it, you would count the rings, but it turns out those rings are more for the structure and for the sturdiness of the shark than actually reflecting temporal trends, which is not so good if you want to know age. So having other ways to age sharks would be important because basically all of our assessments that we are doing to determine if something is overfished or not are based on age, not on length. If we want to know if a species is resilient or not, we look at longevity because it's the best predictor for natural mortality, which is the best predictor for how much extra mortality can we put on the species. So age is really something critical and has not been really looked into in sharks in a genetic way, I would say. Yeah, and my personal opinion also, the effective population size is absolutely fascinating. It gives you basically, so in traditional assessments, you need a long-term time series in order to come up with where's the population standing, do we have a problem or not? And of course, you need some reference to know if the population is above or below this reference in order to know if you have a problem. You have this reference more or less in population, in effective population size, but you get it right away. You don't need a time series. This 1 year of sampling gives you exactly an answer of if we have a problem with inbreeding or not, as far as I understand it. I'm not a geneticist, but I find it fascinating and this says something.
Very interesting. Would someone like to talk about how we're tracking sharks in Nova Scotia? Not to put you on the spot.
I can speak to that. There are two basic technologies used to track the sharks. One is called a satellite tag. They're fairly large units. They go on the back. They have a series of sensors in them. Things like light-based geolocation that will let you basically shoot the sun, like the old-time sailors used to do, and get the latitude and longitude that the animal is at. We'll record the depth, the temperature. You can have heart rate sensors. Other things can be put on that tag. It's all stored on board this mini computer that's on the back of the animal, and an interval of, you predetermine it, but hopefully about a year. Get it to pop up to the surface and send summaries of the data through the satellite network, Arco satellite network, so you don't have to get your tag back and get all that information. So that's been a wealth of information surrounding a lot of these animals. The downside of them is it can go on an animal bigger than about 60 to 70 centimeters in length, and it can cost you up to $6,000 a tag to do it. So there aren't that many of these animals that are tagged. Second system is the acoustic tags, which we are using in the ocean tracking network. These each cost about $360 They can, in some cases, have sensors on them, but mostly it's just a pinger that gives you the location. You have to have networks of receivers that are out in the ocean. We currently maintain about 2,500 of those that are currently looking at these parts here, and they actually recover the global community. So together with them and the network of data exchanges, we have probably about 10,000 of those receivers who now logged into our system. We can track the movements of these highly migratory animals from place to place by knowing date and time that they pass by a receiver in a given location. So those would be the two ways that we're mostly tracking. There's a third way, which is pictures. And there is a photo identification system developing. The Atlantic White Shark Conservancy and Massachusetts Division of Marine Resources started a library of these pictures of these white sharks. And similar to other animals, you can identify individuals. So in theory, as you get pictures from other area, if that animal is known based on those characteristics, you can know that 8 months ago it was in the Gulf of Mexico, and then it was snapped off of Nova Scotia. And that will give you a trajectory, but not a very precise one.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for mentioning the White Shark Photo Database, because we're bringing it. So the last 3 years, we've identified 27 different white sharks based on photography. That's been sponsored. Really, it's an unusual funding model. It's been sponsored by a company. Documentary, so they're paying the time. They're, of course, voluntarily they're doing the work, and it's strictly observational. What I would say is that you're seeing, traditionally fisheries biology was really that. It was biology of things that you ate, and it really was based on catching them and cutting them up and putting their stomachs and looking at their gonads, trying to age them by vertebral and things like that. And I think the overall trend we're seeing is more and more towards less invasive modalities in how we investigate animals. And this was very much my philosophy when we started the Greenland Shark Research Project, which was back in 2003. We didn't know anything about those sharks. We didn't know how big they were. We didn't know how rare they were. We knew for some unknown reason they were coming to shallow water near me. And so we were filming them, we were tagging them. But I resolved right at the start of that project that we were nothing more invasive than tagging. I think that's an emerging trend in research, especially in scarcely abundant species. We're seeing less and less of killing them, trying to do research in a non-invasive fashion, and maybe a fashion that's respecting the integrity of those animals a little more.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Because this is exactly something we're trying currently to establish. It's like a completely non-invasive monitoring for some sharks, like the white sharks with Atlantic shark expeditions, where you film the animal, you don't interact with the animal. There's no hook anymore, there's nothing. You leave the animal alone as much as you can, and you use the photo ID to ID the animals. And then things we are interested in and things we want to find out if they are possible is, for example, condition. I mean, the environment must be good for the white sharks too, not just the pressure from above, but they also need to be in a good environment, and we can tell this hopefully from 3D underwater images from the same individuals. But if you can identify an individual and have a 3D camera in the water, you can also get the body lengths pretty accurately, actually, with the right software. And from this, in theory, you could do more or less full population assessments, which have not been done as far as I know, which would be a completely non-invasive way to do that. So I think the non-invasiveness is really something that should be a focus, and I believe that researchers should not necessarily kill sharks.
Anyone want to add?
Just one thing to add to that. There was a really seminal paper written in 2012 by Neil Hammerschlag and colleagues, and they were studying about, they were reporting on the study of the population of great hammerhead sharks off of Florida. And in that study, it demonstrated that basically by studying that population in the usual invasive fashion, they pretty much extirpated animals from that region. So we have to walk carefully in how we study these animals, especially sparsely abundant animals.
Yep, I agree. It's always important to consider the ethics of how we're carrying out our research methods and making sure that it's minimally invasive, ultimately tied to the goal of conserving critical species. So we've talked a lot about some key ways to track sharks, learn about them, research them, but let's talk a little bit more about the threats that are causing their populations to shift. So I mentioned earlier, overfishing is a big driver. Incidental catching, bycatch is another big driver. Marine degradation, of course, but one of the big ones as well is climate change. So I'd like to ask my panel, how exactly is climate change affecting shark populations? What are the shifts we're seeing?
Well, we're living it right now. So yesterday in my email, I got pictures of 2 wounded seals taken down in the area between Bay that had just classic white shark bites in them. I have never seen, in past years I tracked this, I've never seen pictures of a wounded seal show up much before about the 3rd week in July, and usually it's in August, or a month early the sharks are here. What's going on? The water's 10 degrees centigrade. Again, it's much warmer. I was diving yesterday, it's much warmer than it should be. And you know, every summer now we're seeing tropicals in greater and greater numbers here. Schools of amberjack under the boat, Fred's been here for that. Torpedo rays in numbers we haven't seen before. All kinds of small tropicals like seahorses, butterfly fish, to the extent that we're now collecting them at the end of the season and bringing them in and hooking them with aquatron. We now have a blue crab population in Halifax Harbor. This is a species that's not supposed to live below 10 degrees centigrade. They can't survive below 10. Somewhere in our harbor, they're overwintering and getting to adult size. Something's going on.
Maybe just to add on that, I assume everybody here likes breathing. Yeah. So eelgrass beds are an extremely important carbon sink, possibly the most important carbon sink on our planet. And Chris mentioning the blue crabs, they're part of the reason a lot of those eelgrass beds are being decimated. They're feeding on the roots of them. You know what feeds on crabs? Skates do. So it's really important that we're aware and we're protecting our skates. But what's happening, there was a study in the Gulf of Maine done on little skates, which we also have here in Nova Scotia, of course, that warming waters and ocean acidification were actually damaging the egg cases of these little skates, and they weren't developing properly, making them more vulnerable to predators themselves. So it's just a very small, a single species example that was found how climate change is affecting a skate, but if you think about the ecosystem as a whole and what impact that could have, you can bring it all the way back to us breathing. Maybe a little bit dramatic, but I think it gets the point across.
I think for me, one of the scariest components of the warming is the projections regarding fisheries production in our area. We're looking at probably a decline of about 30% in fish populations writ large across the North Atlantic area. This is in part because the water column is going to stratify and we won't have the movement of nutrients down deep up into the surface areas and mixing. Our response to this has been to deal with our atmospheric warming by trying to find more ways to shove more of this heat into the ocean, and more of the carbon into the ocean through various geoengineering components. And this is just going to aggravate this particular problem. So I'm pretty terrified that our thinking is still not getting to that complicated series of linkages that we need to be thinking about, because we're going to make it a lot worse rather than better as we try to solve individual problems.
Couldn't agree more. There was a study, I think, that went worldwide news about, and it basically came down to that sharks are important in combating climate change. There was a study that was done on tiger sharks in seagrass meadows. And so basically, again, one could use like a much more predominant, much more known species to advocate for the lesser known, or to advocate for the ones that more interest for the nerds, because the winter skate might be really our tiger shark. So for our seagrass beds, it might be really those species who are much more important. As Chris said, we have like the egg cases found all over coastal areas. They are gone. That must have an effect on these ecosystems. Now, if you try to restore seagrass beds, which is a good idea to fight climate change, and you have all of the crabs digging out the seeds, you will not be successful. There should be a predator on those. If this predator is not there anymore, and we just don't know because we have lost the knowledge that they were ever inshore, then this, of course, is a problem, and we can figure out all kinds of things. But the natural way to do so would be to reintroduce threatened species that have been there. So like a rewilding project, if you will, For threatened species, for example, the skate, they are important to balance those predators in quotation marks, on seagrass or anything that's actually important to fight climate change.
I think when it comes to climate change, it's important to appreciate, consider the complexity of how interconnected ecosystems are and the way the ocean works in general. So very good points there. We can switch gears a little bit, unless anyone wants to add to that topic. Nope. I think shark conservation or shark research is an attractive field for many, many people and a growing field, which is wonderful. And I would be curious to know, as four experienced panelists who have seen, who have had different experiences, what have been some of the most rewarding and then also challenging aspects of your work?
I can start, I suppose. It was just like 2 weeks ago. We were moving and I was unpacking boxes and I found a grade 6 yearbook. And in that yearbook, I had to write what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I literally wrote that I wanted to be a marine biologist and study sharks. So for me, one of the best things is that I am literally living out a childhood dream of mine. It's absolutely rewarding to me that I get to do this and I can help teach the next generation and hopefully inspire them to do the same. And I think, like, aside from that, I feel so lucky to have also joined Manu on the work that our NGO does in Cabo Verde and work with one of the world's most endangered species, because so few people actually get to see the species, or maybe ever will get to see the species. So that's, I think that was another really rewarding thing for me. One of the most challenging things for me, I guess, is everything is a little bit doom and gloom when it comes to shark marine conservation. Their populations are being decimated at such high rates, and it can feel like an impossible challenge. But when you're in a room with people like you guys who are clearly interested in shark conservation, it's inspiring and hopeful to see that so many people care. And again, another reason why I love being a part of the shark class, because year after year, it's reassuring to see people do care, and it's not, you know, just a few of us against the world. So yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, so I was a child in the 60s. I grew up with Jaws. Scared the hell out of me. I remember going out to Peggy's Cove when I was about 12 with my dad, and we were on the rocks there. And that summer, everywhere, every time a floating log went by, somebody thought it was a shark. So we're walking along those rolling granite, rolling landforms out of, below the sight line of the sea. You hear a kid say, "Hey, there's a shark out there." And you're like, yeah, this is 3 times the sun. Let's go on, and you hear it now. You say, "My God, that's a huge shark." Come over the top and into the line of sight of the ocean, and there's a gigantic dorsal fin about 100 meters offshore. It's this high. And remember, this is right after Jaws. People don't know much about sharks. So we were convinced Jaws was right out there. It was a 25-foot long winged shark. And this fin just cruised very, very slowly. Of course, it's a basking shark. So that's just an anecdote. So most rewarding, I think there's 2 things I can say about that. What's super rewarding here at Dal is the interaction with the students in shark school. We have an elite course. We have elite instructors. We have elite guest lectures. And we just are really lucky to have nucleated such a bunch of shark nerds in one location. So I love that about being at this institution. I love the institution itself. It's a great, great school. For myself personally, I would have to say the most rewarding things have probably been the realm of discovery. And, you know, when you've come face to face with a species that nobody has ever seen underwater or had a natural interaction with, and this is what happened with our shark work, we're literally the first people to swim with these things. And these days of molecular biology and genomics and so on, whole animal organismal biology isn't cute or sexy anymore. But I can tell you, you learn a tremendous amount by swimming with these creatures and living in the school. I'll give you an example. Fred and I have learned in the course of our studies of the Atlantic torpedo ray, which is this gigantic shocking machine that kills things with huge amounts of voltage and looks like an alien spacecraft. They're just the craziest, wackiest looking 90 kilos of cartilaginous flat chart you've ever seen. And these things, very little is known about them. So they were heavily studied for electrophysiology, especially in Woods Hole. We don't know how old they get. We don't know where they breathe. The basic things that any 10-year-old would ask you, we don't know the species. So we've been doing studies on those animals as well with telemetry. And for instance, my working theory is that these things go up and down the coast. They're more common between about 22 and 30 miles north. And kind of Cape Cod itself is really where we got to hang out. Well, it turns out we put a satellite tag on one in the North Atlantic. This is a sort of revolutionary thing to find out when using these new modalities that take us places we never could go. Those sort of discoveries of just brand new novel things like face-to-face with a human shark and watching how it behaves. You don't know what it's going to eat you. Being in the water with a torpedo ray in heavy current, observing it bend its body disc and actually glide upstream like it draws. These are things nobody's seen before, and those sort of discoveries are very exciting. So as far as challenges go, I think now I'm getting older, I'm finding the physical challenges of getting into the water with a great deal of body that's been diving for almost 50 years. That's getting harder. Under some circumstances, having the will to go back in the water when you've had a bad scare. I had a bad scare with the white shark a couple of years ago. I'll just admit to you that's a universal challenge for me. So when you study these big, charismatic, and sometimes dangerous animals, you have to go at it with a certain attitude that you're studying them in a respectful way. You're also going to try and preserve your life. That's if you have a really active imagination, that can be challenging. I'll leave it at that.
So Chris has introduced himself as being old. From where I sit, he's still a punk kid for the record. And having said that, that's the meaning for my response to this question. Both a challenge and a positive story, I guess, stems from how I've seen the ocean change from the point that I was a kid growing up in Situate, Massachusetts, off the coast of Boston, where as a snorkel alert, as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, caught 20 feet off the shoreline, the ocean was full of fish, things were happening. We then started to go through a series of real anthropogenic shocks to the area. Oil spills were coming in large volumes from ships that were coming into Boston Harbor. Plastic pollution was happening, huge eutrophication events, things like that. The positive side of that was legislation and movement on the part of the public to try to restrict a lot of those things. And suddenly the oil stopped, and these other insults stopped. And things actually got better in the ocean, except that all the marine life disappeared. And that was the overfishing issue, and that's really where we sit in life. So our task is to recognize the resilience that is there in the ocean. It is capable of recovering if we attack these issues and we deal with them. But also understand now that humanity is both the problem and the solution to this one, and any solutions that are going to bring the effects that we're looking for are going to have to incorporate the various groups into these discussions. So to give one example, this one applies in Canada and the US, surrounding the lobster fishing and the right whale fishing. If this is going to work, we've got to get the fishermen to buy into this. We are not going to be able to control them at gunpoint in all of these areas. They refuse to abide by that one. So how do you get them to buy in? You have to include them in the discussions. You have to come forward with rational and, to some degree, tailored policies. Things like in areas where there has never been a right whale in the past, and there's no reason to expect that there's going to be one in the future, don't impose the same measures and restrictions that you would in the areas that are being frequented with them. Suddenly you have reasonable approaches and people see reasonable. That's going to have to be our pathway forward.
Thinking about one of the best moments, maybe I was thinking about how Boris and I were 2015 in Cabo Verde on a Sea Shepherd boat. We were not doing something with Sea Shepherd, we were just on the boat invited by a local NGO who were telling us about the problems of European and Asian vessels coming in and just fishing away all their sharks. And they didn't know what to do. There was nothing built up on sharks. There were projects for seabirds, there were projects for mammals, there were projects for sea turtles, but nothing for sharks. There was no localist knowledge about sharks. There was nothing like this. This was in 2015. Last year, we have been there, and there's now a local shark monitoring. There's a shark researcher dedicated in this NGO. He has a team of 4 people who monitor sharks year-round. They actually do inform the government about this, and they use now part of the data to push for a new MPA where one is really needed. And this was just one of the best moments, I think. And then coupled to this, so really like a change that you can make, and coupled to this, so it's not all just theoretical research. You can actually really have applied effect on something out there. And I think this is wonderful. And also last year, we did a lecture there on sharks to a group of West African master students. So they were all over West Africa. And after the lecture, someone came, and he was from Nigeria, and said he had no idea that there were sharks in their coastal waters. He was always told that sharks only occur offshore. Well, the local shark population, in short, has just been completely decimated, most likely 20 years ago, but he was still a kid, so no one knew about this, no one taught about this, and his response to me was, I will go back now and will save all the sharks. And that was just yeah. And I think, so a vision with this maybe would be that I would really, it also, as Chris already mentioned, the students here, that they give so much back, and it's so great to see so many people that are passionate about this topic, which I, of course, believe it's a very important topic. And I would really love to make this more applied, to have like the students already really participating in shark conservation that is changing something out there. And I think it's possible, and I think we should do it.
Thank you for sharing. I'd like to answer this one briefly if I can as well. So I've had some experience doing shark safety work, and I can say that one of the most challenging things has been trying to convince people that sharks aren't mindless monsters out to get them. And unfortunately, it's very difficult because we're not born being afraid of sharks. It's something that we learn throughout time, through media, through movies like Jaws that have tainted a really inaccurate pictures of how sharks behave. So a positive perception of sharks is really critical to conservation, and this is also one of the most rewarding parts of the work I've been doing, actually, is just seeing the positive shift that's been occurring in my lifetime, which isn't that long, but still in my lifetime, just to see how much people now care about sharks and are curious about sharks and want to challenge their own ways of thinking about sharks. And I think that's really critical to some of many of the things that we're trying to achieve today for these species. So yeah, just want to add that.
Maybe one last anecdotal challenge. One of the most challenging things in Dal was convincing the university legal department that there was no liability in having a shark course with all those heads on. That is a discussion that went on for ages with me.
Also, I've participated in a shark course. If anyone is thinking of it, I highly recommend with Manuel and Kirsti. They're wonderful. We have a few moments left, I believe, so we're just going to pose our last question. And that's really, how can anyone get involved in shark conservation? Do you guys have any tips to share?
Well, don't want to do like, so an easy way, of course, would be through citizen science projects, and we are setting up one right now. I wanted to start with my sentence. I don't want to talk about white sharks again, but it's really like a good way of making lasting money to put into other shark species and skates. When I talk about sharks, I always include the skate and the race. And there is the opportunity, and there will be the opportunity more for shark viewing trips out here. And actually the idea of those viewing trips is that everyone on board becomes part of the scientists on board helping with the science, helping with the research. For example, to establish something like a non-invasive condition monitoring on sharks or something like this. So this is something everyone could do, is just like participating in those trips. whereas it funds some part of shark conservation, but it will also give you hands-on experience with shark research, and you have 7 hours to bug up with shark research and ask all of the questions that I can't because we are on board.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a million answers to this question, but I think this event is supposed to be an Oceans Week event, and I think events like that are already a good start in getting people involved. I've been away from Nova Scotia for 3.5 years now, so it's been a few years since I've been to Halifax Oceans Week, and it seems to have really grown since the last time, so I was really excited about that. But to be honest, I think maybe that's something I would rather hear from in the audience, like how would they feel they could be involved more? Because as a researcher myself, I would want to know, how can I help you be involved in the shark science? If there is a way that I could help in any way, or maybe somebody has a brilliant idea that we've never thought of, I know that's something that I would be interested to hear.
One way not to do this, and this is something I've had to cope with, is purchasing your own receiver units on the ground, so you want to know where the white sharks are, so you can go free diving at a particular moment. Okay, these are big and powerful animals, and you have to respect them in the environment. So, having said that, there's a really interesting model down in Massachusetts called the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. Now, these are citizens that have come together to try to support the research activity, knowing that they really don't want to be in the pointy end of dealing with these big, powerful animals and tagging them, but rather there was a huge job to support it, to support the public education component, to assist with the fundraising, that provided cash that could be used to match state grants and federal grants, and doing things. They maintain merchandising, great store online. Take a look, see what they got to offer. But that has opened up huge opportunities for these people. They walk the beaches and they talk to people and they explain various components about that. So there's a niche there for something like that to happen here.
I think the other thing is we're picking our favorite species now and protecting them. But we really, it's so hard. How do you protect an ecosystem? And I have 3 letters for you. MPA. We have had an Oceans Act in Canada since 1990. We're slowly, finally, 30 years later, starting to see some MPAs being created. The goal was to have 10% of the shoreline in literal Canada protected. You wanted to have one thing to take to your political overlords. It's that we need more MPAs. We protect large bodies of water, underwater, pieces of the ecosystem. Then you have habitat that can't be destroyed, can't be polluted. It can be minimally or not fished at all. And then all of a sudden, everything in the water column thrives. And this has been shown in many other jurisdictions. We still don't really understand how to do it. I think you can have it both ways. You can have an MPA where you still fish. Maybe you can really. But the tabula rasa is what's needed. And I think push for one simple change that will protect a lot of things in the system, including the ones we bring. That would be your goal.
Thank you. I have one more surprise question, if you guys won't be too angry at me for doing this. But I'm wondering, what's your favorite shark, and what's a fun fact about the shark? I can start if you guys need time to think of it. All right. My favorite shark is the basking shark. And I didn't know this until a few years ago, actually, which is a bit silly on my part, but they've actually breached out of water, often numerous times in a row and numerous times throughout the day, which I found astonishing because they're typically quite slow and I would say lethargic, but it turns out that they can launch themselves out of the water quite impressively. There's different speculations as to why. Some people say that it might be to dislodge parasites. Some say that, like whales, they kind of do it to send some like sound underwater to communicate some sort of social thing, like hey, I'm here, or something like that. But yeah, that's my fun fact about basking sharks. Who wants to go next?
Very obviously, mine's black-chinned guitarfish. That's what my thesis was on. Not only does this animal look like it is a dinosaur, like the name is totally deceiving. You would think, black-chinned guitarfish, they'll have black chins. Wrong, they do not. It makes it very hard to identify in the field. But what's also very cool about this species that we've been finding in Cabo Verde is that their skin color seems to match the sand color from the area that we're fishing them in. I'm sure that's not unique to them, but that was the first time I've seen something like that happen, and I just thought, wow, that's amazing. So it just makes our job as researchers even more difficult when we're trying to identify a species out there that is so elusive, critically endangered. It's supposed to have this black chin, and it's a different color depending on the beach that we're fishing at to tag. So I just thought that was very fascinating.
I didn't know that.
They also have one of the world's largest genomes as well, so that's larger than a human's, which I find really cool.
For beach finding dogfish, they are probably one of the friendliest sharks that are out there. Many dives, I've been out there, you turn to your right, and suddenly there's a spiny dogfish looking over your shoulder, trying to see what you're doing as you're moving through. So that was that. And in terms of a fun fact, many of you know that if you roll certain sharks on their back, they go into a state of anesthesia called isotonic immobility. Use that quite frequently, but it turns out that there's at least one very large blue shark that when rolled on its back did not do that, and the captain of our vessel went right into the water when he took the tail back on that. So it was a really interesting day.
Well, here it goes between spiny dogfish and black-chin guitarfish. That would have maybe been my answers for both of them. So, but sorry, Kirsti, I have to go with the black-chin guitarfish as well, because you get a shark and a ring in one hand. It's unbelievable. What more can you ask for?
What's your fun fact?
Get a shark and a ring in one hand.
Everybody.
Always a comedian, man. Yeah, I think the great hammerhead is pretty cool. Up till recently, I would have said the spiny dogfish too. I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I was a kid, I worked as a gooey duck diver. Who knows what a gooey duck is? Oh, what marine biologists do. Gooey ducks are these giant phallic clams that grow in British Columbia. BC's famous for oversized marine life. You got the biggest octopus in the world. You got the biggest sea lion in the world. You got the biggest starfish in the world. And this is part of the giantism that's seen in that particular Pacific Northwest ecosystem, when there's lots of goodies and plankton-filled water. So when I was working underwater collecting these clams, which you do diving your own surface air supply, and using a great big 200 psi water hose like a fire hose with a valve on it, you turn this thing on, and excavate the bottom with it, and dig up these big clams into the bay. On a good day, you could harvest 2,000 pounds. The divers getting 12 cents a pound, so back in the 1970s, it was a pretty big pot for a kid. So that paid my way through university and vet school. But the reason I'm telling you all this is towards the end of the summer in the Strait of Georgia, we would get these monstrous aggregations of dogfish. And there was a school of dogfish 5 miles long between the end of Hornby Island, for those of you who know the strait, right up past Comox. And we're diving in the middle of this in very bad visibility. Down there in the bottom, within visibility, which was 10 feet, there'd be 100 of them. There were so numerous you could push them to the side. Roll over on your back and looked up, you could see them crisscrossing above you in the water column. And once in a while, you get a nudge. They're little guys, they don't have much for teeth, but you get a 4-footer. And they were there as a breeding aggregation. Long gone. That doesn't happen anymore. That population was fished out and extirpated, which is sort of sad, because after a while, when you overcame the sort of natural, slight fear of having hundreds of thousands of dogfish around you, it became kind of interesting, because you sort of became part of the hive mind of the school as we're working way down there. Which leads me to the other thing, which is that, on a day that I took 400 gooey ducks, we didn't know each one of those clams was probably somewhere between 50 years old. So you do the math on that, you're wiping out like 20 to 40,000 years of cumulative life every day. And I was down there hundreds of days. So I think part of why I'm involved now in marine conservation and teaching the shark courses, I'm paid back some of that karma that I planted all those 50 years ago when I was doing that. So.
I hope you all noticed that he actually linked high tuition fees to the overfishing of the gooey duck population. Just, Chuck, I hope you picked that up.
I don't know how he did that. Okay, so we've reached the question portion of our panel discussion. So if you have a question, please ask, or if you want to tell us about your favorite shark, that's fine too. There's no requirements, but if you want to address someone specifically, just address your question and we'll have a mic going around here.
And I think everyone should say what their favorite shark is.
I think so too.
I think that would be really fun. Mine is a port eagle. Yeah, always a fan of the port eagle, cousin of a white shark. So that's my fun fact.
Hi, I just wanted to know what the status of the shark finning issue is.
Who wants to?
There might be others in the room who can speak more about this from a general or North American perspective, but having seen and having colleagues who also work a lot in Africa, where you see containers full with fins that are declared as tuna-fish, like as tuna. I think it's not the only problem. It's not a major problem. A major problem is also bycatch and the fisheries for the meat and the developing meat market, of course. So these are basically the most important problems at the moment. But it is still a huge concern because there's just literally everything that I learned about management and how you can protect something. I don't see how this works there. This is just like Wild West, and we have no information on this. But from the glimpse that we are seeing, I think it's much worse than was estimated and then it's expected. So I think it's still a big problem. That's not the only problem.
We just actually here at Dal, we did a recent study into this issue, and the good news is that shark finning is declining quite rapidly, that the use of whole sharks in the exploitation of sharks is still slightly increasing, mostly in coastal waters, less so in international waters. But the question I really wanted to ask you is, we're in Canada here, right? And Canada is a leader in shark conservation, I would say. We were among the first to ban finning in, I think, 1994, and we were the first nation at large to ban the export of shark fins. We produced a young filmmaker named Rob Stewart who put shark finning and sharks on the map worldwide, and it was also very good for Dalhousie because it's attracting a lot of students to our program here. Can you maybe speak what else Canada can and should do to remain a leader in elasmobranch brand conservation and management? What are we missing and what should we talk to our representatives about?
Well, there was this question from you. I can just go first. So if you ask me and I have just a second to think about, I would say expand more research on skates and rays. I think they're completely overlooked. As more, if you remember, like earlier I said, as more we know, as more we get to realize how bad the state actually is. It's the same for skates and rays, actually. I think as more we learn about them, as more we learn how much in jeopardy they are. That would basically be maybe my main point. Other than that, I think there's a lot of really innovative ways things could be remodeled, redone. Talking about the shark class a lot of times this evening, I think there's so much potential to really expand this and make this also world leading in terms of kind of a new structure or maybe university talk courses would be taught more light.
Or as you actually know this as well as anybody else, but the great majority of resources that go into marine research here go into the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And they have a very narrow mandate letter and they focus on commercial species. So when we're dealing with many of these groups that are outside of that and perhaps covered under SARA, yes, provides paper protection, but there is no commitment for the kinds of resources needed to actually do something to bring them back from the brink. So challenge at the moment is within the university sector, we're more capable and more agile to address a lot of these particular issues. Quite frequently, the products that we produce are being ignored when it comes to the decision-making process, in part because when you communicate them into the system, they don't seem to move anywhere. They don't get up to where the decision makers are or where they need to be. So finding that way, perhaps this ocean decade is underway right now to improve the communications levels and to use the capabilities that are present in the academic and NGO sector with the gorilla in the room, which is DFO and its resources, and come up with something that would address these larger issues and eventually towards that true ecosystem management that is everybody's goal and grail and things would be perhaps the best target we could have for ocean science and sustainable development.
Brett, I wonder if you could speak, in the US, they have this very different system where they have universities that actually have specialized in support and marine infrastructure, collaborative way, harbor branch is one. These are universities that have a particular charter, and other institutions, they have a network. I know very little about it, but I often wonder, they're giants and they're midgets by comparison economic-wise, but what about a system like that? They're sea grant institutions, that's what it's called. Can you tell us about that? I don't really understand it very well.
Well, there are a couple of models. There are also private institutions as well as the sea grant institutions. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is a good example. Famous for finding the Titanic. Why are we talking about the Titanic, right? Certainly that one. The trick in these institutions is to have a clear focus and a clear identity, because you're constantly lobbying in Congress to try to maintain your funding to do this one. I worked for Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution when I first started my career. I was actually running the odd little salmon research station they had on the Quebec North Shore. I've been shipped up to do that. This was Woods Hole's secret. They didn't want anybody to know about this one. It was being done because Seward Johnson and Johnson & Johnson's baby powder mandates and other such things had been taking salmon fishing, and then he was hit up by the salmon fishing industries, or the salmon fishing recreational community, to try to fund salmon research, and he decided that would be a good idea, but he wanted his friends at Woods Hole to run it, and Woods Hole wanted to be on Seward's will when Seward was going to pass away and achieve things, so they agreed to run this, but it was a risk to the identity of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution as a blue water institution. So, one day, the president of Woods Hole woke up and found in the front page of the science section of the New York Times a big article tooting the fact that Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution was studying beavers in Canada, and all hell broke loose, and my boss at the time was actually fired from the institution over this one. So because all of this is expensive, because you have to maintain that flow of the resources needed to do it, keeping the messaging tight and keeping it in the right place at the right time is really, really critical.
Now, one other thing I might add is that, we're in the cradle of this right here. Dallas, Canada's Ocean University. And, there are programs we're doing now that we can put more into. And one of them, I think, is our scientific diving program. We have 10 kids every year who just fight to get into that course in the summer. And every student who comes here and studies marine biology, and there are hundreds of them, maybe in the audience, they come here, they want to learn to dive, they want to learn how to get into the environment, how to use science tools in the environment. So enhancing some of those programs at the student level would really enhance the student experience, in my opinion. It's the same, we have limited resources to do the shark course. I do it because I love it. I don't have to, I'm in debt for the university, but I love it, I love the students, and it's a worthwhile thing to do. And, we at the moment can only place, I think, 20 students in each module, and we offer 2. But, we have 100 applicants, 100 qualified applicants every year for this course, and it's a super popular course. So maybe it should go somewhere else. Maybe it should become a course that's offered in the semester. Maybe it should be broken down and integrated. Some of the other things we do, like telemetry courses. But I would love to see some of what we're talking about to stick here in the institution and help us move forward with what we're already doing. As we turn out students who leave here, they go all over the world. The experiences they have, particularly in the shark course, are unique. There's just nowhere else you can go to see and taught how to do telemetry properly, with proper surgical technique in the blue sharks. That doesn't happen anywhere else. You have some guy leaning on the side of the Boston River with a jackknife, do it correctly here. And that's one of my legacies here as a vet who works with aquatic species. I want us to be state of the art. So that's my plug for that course and the students who take it.
Okay.
I think we have another question.
Hi, Hugh Williamson. I'm with the Marine Affairs Program in the International Ocean Institute. But my question is on the shark recreational tours that they're planning off Nova Scotia, and whether or not by attracting sharks into proximity with the tour boats is going to actually increase the interaction between some of these larger sharks and the human population around here. It's like sort of bear feeding or wolf feeding or things like that. Are you actually asking for trouble by encouraging that kind of activity?
Maybe I can cover that because I am involved with this. So there will be no shark feeding, and there will also be, the trips will go to very specific locations where there are seals already occurring. This is why we believe white sharks are there. There will be at least 3 nautical miles off of any popular beach. If there is someone seen surfing in the water, there won't be anything. And in addition to this, the sharks won't be fed. So the challenge is a little bit more to find the sharks where they naturally occur already and bring them to the boat. So I don't really see so you wouldn't attract sharks from miles away. You would only attract the shark that's already in the vicinity of the boat. So of course it would be easier from a business model to just chum the water as much as you can and attract all the sharks and then have a lot of sharks. But the idea behind this is really more like research focused. And to answer a couple of questions, also when are the sharks here, in which conditions are the sharks here, when it would be less safe to go into the water maybe. And for this, of course, you want to have natural conditions. You don't want to attract the sharks from anywhere else. So at least Atlantic Shark Expedition is what I'm involved with, at least this business, and as far as I know, it's the only one with the permit. Will do it in a way that you go, if possible, to offshore uninhabited islands where seals are, and this is where you will put a little chum bucket in the water and hope that you attract the sharks that are there already to the boat.
So, I don't know that there are any neutral voices in the room we're talking about right now. You have surfers who are very concerned, understandably, because of all, when you look at the international shark attack files, it's surfers and swimmers who have the highest mortality rate for white shark attack, and it's high. You get attacked in the water by white shark, you have less than 50% chance of survival as a swimmer. Surfer, if you're diving, you're only 8% liable to die. So it sort of depends on where you are in the water column and so on. Having said that, we've been out attracting sharks now for 3 years, white sharks, and I can tell you exactly where the white sharks are, exactly where you would be. Within a half mile of shore, they're in shallow water, they're up in 30-foot water, and where the seals are. If you really want to avoid white sharks, stay the hell away from seals, is my advice. They're where the food source is, and that's absolutely unknowable. Now, the other thing is, what about the other users when we're out there doing this? So first of all, we are all doing this separately in different projects, but we work under Species at Risk Act permit. What I can tell you about SARA and the other regulatory permits that we fill out is in the last few years, we've seen a cadre of young 30-something, newly trained within the last 10 years, and very eco-friendly people at DFO and SARA. They're under an absolute microscope. So all the conditions, you fill out an 8-page form, in detail what you're going to do, where you're going to do, how you're going to do it, how are you protecting the public, what are the risks, how do you mitigate those. It's a very careful process. Last year, to get our permit, it was 8 rounds with SARA. So this isn't just something you get. You have to earn it. You have to be knowledgeable. The second thing is, there have been a number of publications in recent years that have been based on work done in South Africa and Guadalupe Island, which is an island off the coast of Mexico that has an insane concentration of large white sharks. I've been up there a couple of times, and it's spectacular to see. Both sites, reputable scientists have been looking at whether there's an attraction effect, whether there's a behavior change effect, and have published on this famously Mauricio Hoyos at Guadalupe, a number of different in South Africa. All of whom have concluded in peer-reviewed studies that there's an attraction effect, there's no retention, and there's no training point. Personally, as a scientist and a vet, it's only his work with animals all my life, basically. I find that hard to believe. There are other studies that demonstrate tremendous training, sharks train faster than bats and mice in discriminative testing, learn paradigms, and all those sort of models that we see for operant conditioning, all those things, they train very, very quickly. So I think it's still controversial as to whether there is a training effect and whether doing this would in fact train animals and have them stay in the same area. Having said this, we have never seen the same animal twice, 2 days consecutively. Last year, on November 7th, we saw 7 different white sharks in the location go by. 7 in almost 1 hour. Not one of them was bigger than 10 feet. And they would come by, check out the reef, and that happened. 30 feet of water, half a mile offshore. Right between the swimming here. So yeah, I think the jury's still out, but I think if it's done properly, it's at a minimum to the public. I can tell you the terms of our SARA permit are sort of 3 miles. That if we have a shark bite our baits, we have to reel it 10 miles away. So obviously we have cameras on the baits and we move so the sharks don't bite. Really the idea for us with the baits is to get them close enough to the shark. We have tagged 1 shark last year because it came up with season. All pretty minimally. But I think overall, in our situation, what we have are sharks that are going sort of constantly all not coming back. They're not pass through. The longest resident time we've had for shark was actually the shark we tagged last year. We tagged it and it came back a couple of times when we finally took off. What's the result of all this? Well, one interesting thing is that all the sharks we're seeing are juvenile. This is really interesting because white sharks are thought, when white sharks we're seeing are probably being birthed sort of Long Island Sound south. Dogma, I'm saying dogma because we don't have a lot of that otherwise, is that those juvenile whites that are born then head south, and we head south off the Carolinas, which is a really fish-rich area. That age and stage, they're very much piscivorous, right? The little sharks are really fish sharks. And then when they hit about 10 feet and they go through a genetic change like this guy, then they become marine animators and their little needle-like teeth turn into big daggers, big steak knives. Well, here's the fascinating thing. Of the 27 sharks we've seen, we haven't seen one bigger than that. We also saw 2 years ago a 4.5-footer. That's birth size. Completely unexpected. So some of these sharks, contrary to what's believed, are coming to juvenile. And in fact, the one we saw was probably so there's a lot to be learned even from simple observation studies like the ones we're doing.
This is completely anecdotally, but when I was in South Africa, I did an ecosystem program in Mossel Bay. It was white shark cage diving, and one of my concerns was, are what we're doing causing there to be any negative human-shark interactions on shore? Because in Mossel Bay, if you're familiar with the area, the island is 500 meters from a very popular surfing beach. There's 2 operations that commonly go out there, and they do chum the waters heavily in South Africa, and they do have a huge tuna head fade out there. And the last incident, to the best of my knowledge, was 13 years ago. And they're going on almost every day and doing this. It is just anecdotal. That's just me speaking, so not science-based, but I do think speaking about sharks as a predator is different than speaking about some other predatory animals like lions or wolves, for example.
Thank you for sharing that. Did you want to add something?
Oh, I just recently, it just stuck in my head because a colleague said recently that try to go and skateboard in front of a leopard. It's basically impossible. You couldn't skateboard in front of a leopard, but we are doing this with surfing in front of sharks all the time. I was just a study in California that shows that. So this is not to say that they are not dangerous, and that shouldn't be I think it should be taken very seriously, and I think it's good that DFO takes it so seriously, because you only want to have this done in the best way, also for the sharks, not for the safety of the people too, but also for the sharks. So you don't want to have suddenly 10 operators who all go out there, attract sharks to where they may eventually occur, or for them to hunt after an energy source that they will never get because they're not supposed to feed them. So I think the key is really here, it has to be done responsibly. But it's also a very, I mean, it's an amazing animal. You have to see it, it's beautiful. It takes the fear away from you, I think. It adds respect, but just seeing, if you see a white shark playing with kelp, it's amazing. Like, you just really see it as an animal, not as a monster. And I think there's much to learn from this. And also, to be quite honest, it's not so easy to get money for conservation of sharks, and this is a very lasting way to do so.
We do have time for one more question.
Sorry, just one last observation on that. I was talking to Charlie Huveniers, a shark biologist from Australia. He's running a new study now on one of the offshore islands of Australia where they have big dairy farms. He's got tiger sharks that are swimming around the area. Every Wednesday is offal day. What happens is they come to the cliff and they dump all of the offal from the cows that have been slaughtered, and sometimes entire cows off the edge of the cliff. And you would expect the tiger sharks to be queuing in on that particular source. The fact is finding they're not doing that, which means that there's probably a difference among species, and there's a difference among individuals as to whether you will or will not condition to something like a feeding regime that's present in the place. We just don't know enough to figure that out.
A good point, Fred. I can remember there was a site called Whoriskey in the Bahamas that had been a secret hideout for a multi-billionaire called Robert Aplin. Nixon's best friend, and Nixon would go down and hang out on this island of Aplin. At any rate, the island became a famous sport fishing destination. They started running a golf cart across the island with all the guts from the marina, dumping them in the backside of the island. Bull sharks came in their dozens, and they did definitely acclimate to the point where when they heard the little electric motor on the golf cart, they would come to the beach. So every species is different.
I'm just mindful of time, so we had one more question in the audience. So,
there's one question. So I do believe that the marine protector probably talk here in terms of like shark conservation as like tools for conservation, right? But I do believe that there is a challenge, especially when you're talking about a specific species. If you're talking about like ocean pelagics, like such as great whites, great hammerhead, pressure sharks, short fins. So how do you make a marine protected area that protects these areas compared to like something like a shark or a wildlife, which is kind of relatively sedentary?
You read my 1995 paper, didn't you? I raised the exact same point, which is these species that have transporter, transocean migration, they're very hard to protect. Yeah. And especially as soon as you get outside of the exclusive economic zones around the country. It's just the Wild West out there, and it's unregulated. And I don't have an answer for you. It's a sad fact that those species are super vulnerable. Look at what happened to the oceanic white-tip sharks that used to be in the North Atlantic. They're gone. They're fished out. Even the poor people, pretty well all the mother fish got taken out in the 60s by the Norwegians. So all these species that do these huge migrations are super vulnerable, and the MPA strategy won't work for them. Yeah, maybe a selective closure strategy like we see for right whales and things like that. Don't be fishing poor people so that they have fun when the eel runs are going on, for instance. But that's highly specific to species and location, and would be very hard to enforce.
okay. So is there one more? I think we'll do one last one, and then we'll have to wrap up.
In 1963, Henry Hicks came to Dalhousie as president, and I joined the university as lecturer in engineering. And I think Henry Hicks consulted widely about what should happen here, and one of his conclusions was the creation of the oceanography, the addition of oceanography to Dalhousie's programs, and considerable funding to put the facility over here in place to allow that. And I'm sure Henry Hicks, long deceased, would be very pleased to see this event today.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
a really wonderful note to end on. So I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Kirsti, Manu, Fred, and Chris, for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us. It was very insightful, very interesting. And I want to thank our audience for being so attentive and engaged and for showing up, period. That means a lot to all of us. And to our organizers, for the Faculty of Science, thanks so much for helping this come to life. And we hope to see you at our next events. Have a nice evening.